Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the epic Battle of Thermopylae to uncover the historical reality behind the legendary last stand. And look, if you think you already know this story just because you've seen the movies, well, prepare to have your perspective completely shifted. We're going to break down the actual tactics, the real numbers, and the geopolitical forces that violently collided in what is easily one of the most famous military encounters in human history. Right off the bat, there is a massive contrast between Hollywood fiction and historical fact. Pop culture, like the movie 300, gives us this young, shirtless King Leonidas fighting with a tiny, isolated band of perfectly chiseled Spartans. But the reality? It's honestly way more interesting. Leonidas was actually around 60 years old during this battle, and they certainly weren't fighting half naked. They were heavily armored. Most importantly, they weren't alone. Leonidas actually commanded a united Greek coalition of around 7,000 men. It's a wildly different picture than the one pop culture painted for us, isn't it? Part 1. Two vastly different worlds. To understand exactly how this clash happened, we've got to look east. King Xerxes inherited this absolute behemoth of an empire, stretching all the way from modern-day Iran down into Egypt and even parts of India. He was completely determined to avenge his father's previous defeat to the Greeks at Marathon, so he amassed an incredibly diverse, massive invasion force. Modern historians estimate this army was somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 strong. And they were highly organized, structured strictly in multiples of 10. They had units of 10, 100, 1,000, and of course their elite 10,000-man bodyguard force known as the Immortals. This was an unstoppable juggernaut bearing down on a totally fractured Greece. Now, on the flip side, we have the Spartans, and this brilliantly illustrates why they were so uniquely feared by that juggernaut. From day one, it was about survival. Elders inspected infants, and only the absolute healthiest survived. By age 7, boys were literally taken from their homes and plunged into the agoge, a grueling, state-sponsored training program. To toughen them up, these kids were forced to go barefoot everywhere and given only a single cloak to wear year-round. They were deliberately starved just a bit to encourage them to learn stealth by stealing food. But get this, they were severely punished if they actually got caught. This brutal life cycle basically ensured that by the time they graduated, they weren't just soldiers, they were ultimate survivalists, unbreakable warriors. Moving right along to part 2, the ultimate war machines. Because, let's be honest, battles aren't just won by tough guys, they're won by superior engineering and strategy. Let's look at the gear. There's a critical mismatch here that pretty much defined the entire battle. You've got the heavily armored Spartans in bronze helmets, breastplates, and greaves. Their primary weapon was the dory, a massive wooden spear stretching up to 2.5 meters long, which gave them incredible reach. Compare that to the Persian infantry. They were lightly armored, carrying much shorter spears. Their main defense? A wicker shield. Now, wicker is fantastic for stopping arrows from a distance, which fit their usual combat style perfectly. But in close quarters melee combat against heavy bronze? Absolutely disastrous. So the real game changer here is the phalanx formation. This wasn't just a grouping of soldiers. It was a highly disciplined, interlocking wall of bronze. Notice how that massive shield, the hoplon, protected not only a Spartan's own left side, but overlapped to cover their neighbor's right side. If one man flinched or dropped his shield, the whole line was vulnerable. It required absolute trust. The front 2 rows would thrust those massive spears, while the rows behind them would literally push their bodies forward to maintain this crushing physical pressure against the enemy. Part 3, strategy at the hot gates. With this massive invasion looming from the north, the allied Greek force, the Hellenic League, had a terrifying math problem on their hands. They had to pick the perfect geographic choke point to neutralize the sheer size of the Persian army. They chose Thermopylae, meaning the hot gates, because it was an incredibly narrow path. Picture it. On one side, you have the churning sea. On the other side, sheer, impassable mountains rising 1,000 meters straight up. This meant Xerxes literally couldn't spread his 80,000 men out. The terrain acted like a giant funnel, forcing the Persians to fight on a tiny front where their numerical advantage basically vanished. It was an absolute tactical masterstroke. Let's circle back to that 7,000 number for a second. Like we touched on earlier, King Leonidas didn't just bring 300 Spartans. Actually, the reason the main Spartan army wasn't there at all was because of a sacred religious festival called Carneia, which strictly forbade military campaigns. Leonidas didn't want to anger the gods, so he took his 300 personal guards, along with roughly 600 helots, their servants, and united with Arcadians, Thespians, Thebans, and local Phocians. Together, this 7,000-man coalition marched off to hold the line. Looking at the actual terrain, Thermopylae was basically divided into three narrow gates. Leonidas brilliantly parked his main forces right behind a ruined, century-old structure called the Phocian Wall at the middle gate. But Leonidas was no rookie. He was a seasoned commander. He knew there was a massive vulnerability, a secret goat path winding through the mountains that could bypass his wall completely and dump the enemy out near the east gate. To lock this down, he stationed a contingent of his Phocian allies high up on that mountain path to keep a watchful eye out for any flankers. All right, part 4. The 3-day battle. When the colossal Persian army finally showed up, Xerxes actually waited 4 full days. He fully expected this tiny Greek force to just run away in absolute terror, but they didn't. They stayed put, exercising, calmly combing their hair. So Xerxes sends a messenger demanding they lay down their weapons and surrender. And King Leonidas delivers this iconic, totally defiant response, Malan labe, meaning come and get them. It was a bold, unforgettable statement. It told the Persians, without a doubt, that Greek morale was unbreakable. If Xerxes wanted that pass, he'd have to bleed for every single inch of it. So the battle kicks off. On day 1, the Spartans didn't just stand there like statues. They deployed this brilliant, albeit high-risk maneuver called a feigned retreat. They would engage the Persians and then suddenly break formation and pretend to run away in a total panic. The Persians, thinking they'd broken the Greek lines, would break their own formations to wildly chase after them. But then, once the Persian ranks were completely disorganized, the Spartans would spin around in perfect unison, lock their shields right back into that tight phalanx, and slaughter the chaotic, unprotected enemy. It was a devastatingly effective trap. For 2 full days, it was total Greek dominance. The Spartans held the Phocian Wall effortlessly. Xerxes even sent in his elite immortals, and no joke, they too were completely repelled by that bronze wall. The Persians were taking horrific casualties. But, everything changed on the night of day 2. A local Greek man named Ephialtes, looking for a rich reward, betrayed his own people. He sneaks into Xerxes' camp and reveals that secret mountain path. So, under the cover of darkness, Xerxes dispatches his immortals right over the mountains, bypassing the Phocian Wall entirely. By the dawn of day 3, runners show up to inform Leonidas that the mountain path has fallen. They were officially outflanked. Knowing certain death was knocking on the door, Leonidas holds an urgent war council. Roughly 70% of the allied Greek leaders voted to retreat, to pull back and save their armies to fight another day. However, 30% of the council, spearheaded by the Spartans, resolved to stay right there at the hot gates. Now, what happens next is often misunderstood as some blind suicide mission. Actually, scratch that. It was a highly calculated military maneuver known as a rearguard action. Leonidas ordered the vast majority of that 7,000-man army to retreat back into southern Greece. He deliberately sacrificed a small force, his 300 Spartans plus a few hundred insanely brave allies, to act as a human shield. Their sole purpose? Tie up the massive Persian army just long enough to delay them, protecting the fleeing Greek allies from being chased down and slaughtered from behind by Persian cavalry. And that brings us to the legendary final stand. The 300 Spartans, standing shoulder to shoulder with fiercely loyal Thespians and Thebans, fought ferociously to the bitter end. They knew for a fact they weren't going home. The fighting was intensely brutal. King Leonidas himself was killed in the melee, and the remaining Greeks fought frantically just to protect his fallen body from being captured. Finally, pushed back and totally surrounded, the Persians refused to even engage them in close combat anymore. Instead, they unleashed a massive, endless hail of arrows, finally overwhelming the very last of the Spartan and allied defenders. The hot gates had fallen, but the ultimate sacrifice of Leonidas and his men bought the rest of Greece the one thing it desperately needed: time to prepare. And this leaves us with a massive question. While this unbelievable land battle was happening at Thermopylae, there was actually a parallel naval battle taking place just 40 miles away at Artemisium. With the Spartan wall broken and Xerxes' army now marching freely into Greece, how in the world would the Greek fleet respond? And how would that naval clash change the ultimate fate of Western civilization? Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and always keep questioning the history you think you know.